Hello everyone, my name is Tomiwa Aladikomo, and this is The Next Wave by Tech Cabal. Today we're talking about 5G in Africa, how much progress we've made with adoption, how much is still left to be done, and how we can maximize its benefits. With me today, I have the head of Sub-Saharan Africa at the GSMA, Angela Wamono. I also have the Chief Technology and Information Officer at the MTN Group, Mazen Murui. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start with you, Angela. Now, 2G, 3G era is gradually approaching its dusk. Already, many countries globally have announced shutdown dates for both networks, although in Africa, things are still moving a bit slower, and understandably so. These networks have had a good run, but if there's one thing the pandemic has shown us, it's that we're going to be a lot more dependent on the internet than we ever were. But COVID trends are not the only ones that we're seeing. In Africa, fintechs are providing innovative financing options to make it easier for people to afford high-end devices that support more advanced networks. One of these schemes is the increasingly popular buy now, pay later trend. How would you say these various factors are contributing to the way Africa and its technology providers think about the adoption of 4G and 5G networks?
So naturally, demand for these financial and payment platforms has driven mobile device purchases and mobile internet connectivity through 2G, 3G, and 4G. So while 3G is still the dominant internet connection for a majority of our citizens across sub-Saharan Africa, the proliferation of these applications and their demand will support the acceleration of 4G and 5G deployment across the continent. Now, 4G still has some room to grow in most developing markets, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where 4G adoption is still very low, below a fifth of the total connections, and operators are stepping up efforts so that we can migrate our existing 2G and 3G customers to our 4G networks. Globally, we have 4G adoption that accounts for 55% of total connections. And by 2025, we have seen that this will down from a peak of 58% in 2021. And in 2020, 3G in sub-Saharan Africa made the largest chunk of mobile internet connections at 57%, while 4G represented just 16% and 2G represented 26%. And by 2025, we expect 3G to continue representing still at 57%, while 4G will grow to 29%, and 5G will begin to grow at 4%, while 2G sunsets at 10%.
Now, when it comes to 5G, something that's still fairly new, we're seeing some kind of progress on that end. South Africa and Kenya have already rolled out the network, and as of 2020, 18 African countries were either testing or rolling out 5G. In 2021, there were 7 commercial 5G networks in 5 markets across the region, and the GSMA predicts that by 2025, 3% of mobile connections on the continent will be 5G. If adoption continues to grow at this rate, we're looking at new opportunities in healthcare, finance, e-commerce, education, and so on. What excites you the most about these possibilities?
That's exactly true, that there are so many exciting opportunities and industrial applications that can be harnessed using the power of 5G in the coming years in Africa. If we look at the global stage, just to set the scene, we're already beginning to see how in the area of transportation, 5G is playing a crucial role in the last mile delivery, where we are seeing advanced automated vehicles with extremely low latency, transmitting signals with such minimal lag. And this means that with 5G, we're seeing how they're reducing the time for autonomous vehicles to make decisions on the road and ensure greater safety and reliability. Now, bringing it back home to the region in Africa, farming is one area that we can see the use of IoT sensors that will allow our farmers to collect environmental and machine metrics that will help them to make informed decisions, improving every aspect of their operations, from livestock farming to crop farming. And so with 5G, these IoT sensors can be interconnected at higher speeds than ever before. In the other area where we see a higher potential for 5G in Africa is in the area of the health sector. With the capability of higher bandwidth, 5G can enable the use of remote healthcare in our region. It will allow for personal health or medical data collection to be shared at a greater speed from an individual who is in one location to a provider in a different location, and this will allow them to have greater healthcare and related support. So I think there are a lot of use cases that we see, and the potential for 5G is exciting.
Angela, this all sounds very exciting, but what do we need on the policy front to make all of this come together?
I'd like to just say that, to just start off, that 5G and any kind of technology, the mobile industry is a very capital intensive industry. And so to stimulate the investment that is needed for 5G infrastructure, governments and regulatory bodies need to establish a range of policies that will stimulate investment in this area. If you look at what we've previously discussed in terms of the 2G, 3G sunset, we realize that in Africa, the return of investment for what has been put in place in terms of infrastructure still has a bit of runway to go. And therefore, to encourage investors to be able to realize the return of investment, it is critical that we have legal or policy frameworks that will allow technology neutrality in terms of allowing mobile operators who have already invested in 2G and 3G, 4G licenses to carry those over into 5G and not have to reinvest in another form of licensing for 5G. And this will allow eventually the costs to be passed on lower to our consumers, because the affordability for our citizens is a key enabler for why they should go online. Another thing we need to look at is how can we also begin to provide a wider access to site locations for network infrastructure. When we come to the 4G and 5G infrastructure and the technologies around this and their applications, one of the key considerations we need to look at is that these require densification. And what I mean by this is that they require a lot of small cells deployment to be able to realize the potential and the capabilities of 5G, such as higher speeds and low latency. And therefore, it is important that infrastructure and also policies that allow for a wider access to sites are provided so that the infrastructure is allowed and that the experience for our digital citizens is realized. Another area we could look at in terms of facilitating infrastructure development is in the area, obviously, of enabling deployment of backhaul, because we do realize that for the lower latency and the greater speeds to be realized, the backhaul transportation is critical. And therefore, how can governments and regulators also prioritize the efficient use of public and private digital infrastructure, such as consolidating fiber networks and ensuring data and fiber sharing is prioritized?
Fantastic. I think that's pretty clear. What are the areas in which we've struggled with the 4G network that can come to haunt us as we move into 5G if we don't do things differently? Do you have any thoughts on that?
When we look at 5G as a technology evolution from 4G and previous technologies, there are opportunities to learn from the past mistakes as well as the challenges that we faced in the region. Spectrum availability is one of those that we need to consider, spectrum being the foundation of mobile wireless services. So particularly for 5G networks, what we've learned is that we need to have not only a mix of low, mid, and high band frequency spectrum, but we also need to have it in big chunks of bandwidth so it can allow for the realization of the benefits that 5G heralds. And we see that now we are working, globally with the international telecommunications unions, World Radio Communication Conferences, which are being used to progressively look at opportunities to decide on the usage of the radio frequency spectrum across regions. And also infrastructure and technology infrastructure in terms of 5G rollout being a capital intensive business, we also need to look at the business climate as another crucial aspect of 5G's success. So how can we continue looking at cost benefits of 5G rollout and lowering the costs of entry, such as how can we enable the use of innovation and newer technologies, such as the open radio access networks, or policies that will allow for cloud and edge computing, so that we look at how we can lower the cost and the affordability of 5G services so that our digital citizens can adopt those services. Additionally, we'd also like to look at how can we also encourage an openness of risk taking so that Combined with the business-friendly policies, we create an environment that's conducive to wireless innovation and 5G entrepreneurship.
Angela, thank you so much for joining us today and thank you for sharing your insights. We'll pick up the second leg of the conversation with Mazen, but before we continue, we're going to go on a really quick commercial break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, everyone. We're here with Mazen from MTN. Hi, Mazen. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's dig a little bit into the challenges of rolling out 5G in Africa. The biggest challenges that we see, of course, are the amount of investment that's required, as well as how committed the market is to 2G and 3G across the continent. How is MTN thinking about this as you roll out 5G? We know you're already in a couple of markets.
5G technology has become matured in most countries, and the mobile operators around the world are investing millions of dollars into their infrastructure to enable 5G services for their customer base. And same we are doing as MTN. And definitely there are multiple challenges that we are trying to address at this stage. For us as MTN, we are following building a 5G right strategic approach to the 5G deployments to enable capital efficient deployment across our footprint. So there are 5 really elements that we are following in order to make sure that we are deploying 5G right and avoiding the challenges. The first, what we are trying to do is to ensure, and that's what have started already like 4 or 5 years back, with the 4G modernization and deployment that we are rolling out the 4G technology, we made sure that the baseband units that are used for 4G technology are also enabled for 5G. So that means we don't really need to repeat the investments. And the second element, we are trying to use the same network that has been used for 4G previously to be also enabled in terms of core assets for the 5G infrastructure. And the third, we are also leveraging the large fiber infrastructure that we have deployed in our markets for 4G to provide the right and the required backbone for 5G network. And the fourth element, we are initially targeting high value areas and hotspots for 5G rollout to guarantee the return on investments capital. And finally, the fifth element and factor that we are also taking into account, we are pushing to evolve existing network management system to support the future network slicing capabilities to enable 5G to really be running smoothly in our infrastructure for our subscribers.
In 2020, Rob Shutter, who's the former CEO of MTN, said that 5G would have very specific uses as opposed to being a technology for everybody. Is that still the way MTN sees it? Is that the way you see it? Or does it support most use cases, or is it going to be something that is very, very specific in its uses? What do you think?
So generally, 5G unlock a wide range of use cases representing a disruptive leap forward in future communication. So generally, we have 3 categories. We have identified 3 categories across our footprint, and they are also relevant to the telecom industry in general. The first, which is the enhanced mobile broadband, it's actually evolving into a use case for everyone, which is really the use of a faster access to internet. 5G improve the fixed wireless access proposition using the enhanced mobile broadband use case, making it a tangible near-term opportunity to democratize the fixed connectivity in Africa. As well, on the other 2 categories, there is the ultra reliable low latency communication use case category, and as well the massive machine type communication as well use case are mostly enterprise centric use cases being introduced to deliver value to the businesses. Example of those use cases are the assets tracking, utility monitoring, industrial automation, and as well digital health and robotic automations. So all those use cases remain relevant for us to introduce them in our footprint for our subscribers to enjoy the 5G technology.
Thanks, Mazen. All our digital trends are pointing towards increased demand for connectivity, both in urban and rural areas across the continent. What are the things that the key stakeholders groups can do to maximize the deployment of connectivity to people across the continent?
So from MTN perspective, as a mobile network operator, connectivity requirements can be met by really following at least four elements. One, we are making sure that we push for refarming or reusing an existing spectrum that we have introduced and been used for 2G and 3G technology to be more efficient for 4G and 5G technology. The second, as well, we are pushing to use a higher order modulation technology that can really provide a much more wider coverage when it comes to antenna connectivity and coverage on the radio. And third, we are deploying 5G extra capacity as another also way to maximize the output of our radio. And as well, we are using innovative deployments models on the financials, like we are deploying either CapEx model or OpEx model, or through a revenue share models that we're having solutions to expand the coverage to the unconnected. At the same time, we are also working with the regulators in order to also facilitate the process. One, we are asking the regulators, and they have been also very much understanding of those requirements, so the regulator can enable the spectrum neutrality policies to facilitate the refarming of the spectrum. Means the mobile network operators can reuse an existing spectrum that currently being utilized for 2G and 3G to be also utilized for 4G and 5G in the future. As well, we are also expecting the regulators to auction out the new 5G spectrum in time and at the right price to support increasing data growth. And as well, we are expecting regulators to really also offer tax incentives for rural connectivity sites in order to accelerate the expansion of coverage. And as well, we encourage the regulators as well and the governments to relook at the import duties for the devices to allow 5G enabled devices sold in the markets at an affordable price.
Thanks, Mazen. With 5G getting phased in across the continent and 4G already in place, it's clear that we're going to have to phase out 2G and 3G technologies. How long do you think that's going to take, and what are the things that the market needs to do to prepare for that phase out?
So 2G and 3G, the second generation and the third generation device represent around 2/3 of the device penetration in most of the sub-Saharan markets. Therefore, a shutdown of 2G and 3G will only happen and will only be made feasible in approximately 4 to 5 years from now. We see in South Africa that they have 60% of their devices are 4G capable. Therefore, that can be done earlier in 2-3 years from now. So in general, it's not an easy task. It requires a lot of really preparation, and it will take probably 4 to 5 years on average. So we see the possibility in most markets to shut down 3G before 2G, mainly because 3G users have more potential and capability to move to 4G than the 2G users. However, successful 3G shutdown will require as well industry alignments, investment, regulatory support, and a clear execution plan. So we expect the regulators to provide permissions to refarm legacy spectrum to 4G and 5G with support for forced migration and roaming and sharing agreements. And the second, we also expect industry alignments between the operators on legacy network shutdown horizon to mitigate mutual commercial risks. And third, we also expect and we are working on a clear device strategy and customer engagements with supporting marketing initiatives to engage customers and to drive shutdown and migration awareness and enable the movements as smooth as possible. And fourth, we are also expecting and we are encouraging and we are in continuous dialogue with the regulators to ensure there is a regulatory enforcement of right device importation into the markets. And finally, we also are pushing for refarming the spectrum as soon as possible to become vacant and available for 5G deployments in our respective markets.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mazen. This has been a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of it. Thank you to our guests, as well as to our audience for sticking with us throughout this conversation today. Remember, you can tweet at us using the hashtag TheNextWaveCNBC. You can also send in your feedback via email at thenextwave@techcabal.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.